right, everybody, welcome here. We're back. I'm Clayton Pixton. We've got Susan Easton Black there in Provo. I'm in Kansas, and we're talking more about Joseph Smith and the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with one of the best, if not the best. Is that vain for you to think
thanks.
that? Again, I took classes from Susan Easton Black at BYU. Loved her class. I just came across an email today from my brother who had recorded. So everybody recorded your lectures. I don't know why that was a thing, but everybody had their recorders out. And I did too, and my younger brother did too, and he made a compilation of all the lectures and wrote little summaries and was trying to help make those recordings available to us as a family. And I just came across that old email today from years ago, so it was kind of neat to see that. But everybody in my family was like, "Oh yeah, send it to me." And my dad was like, "Well, I can't really play a MP3 DVD. I don't have anything to do that with. So if you don't have an MP3 CD player at your house, don't worry. You can tune into this podcast, and that's why we're doing this." Susan, we talked about Martin Harris last time. I thought we had a great discussion.
I did too.
About him. Who are we talking about today?
Today we're going to talk about Joseph's wife, Emma Hill Smith.
Awesome. Well, so for the song today, I'm going to attempt, I Know That My Redeemer Lives. It's one of the hymns that was selected by Emma in the first hymn book of 1835. Is that right?
That's right.
So the church was there for 5 years, right, before they had their own hymn book.
They had a hymn book. That's right.
Do you have a favorite verse, Susan? There's 4.
I always like the first verse.
First verse. I know that my Redeemer lives. What comfort this sweet sentence gives. He lives who once was dead. He lives, my ever-living head. He lives to bless me with his love. He lives to plead for me above. He lives my hungry soul to feed. He lives to bless in time of need. All right, there you go.
I love that. Big talent is yours, Clayton.
Thank you. It's something I can do to contribute. So kick us off, Susan.
All right, I'd like to tell you about Emma Smith. And as we start out, for some of you who can see her, and you see her in the painting, which is the most popular one of Emma, you'll notice that she's wearing gold beads around her neck. Those beads were the same beads that she was wearing when she was buried. She wore a green dress with magenta flowers. I also wanted to say something about her hairdo. You realize the men in our listening audience would have no interest, but all the women were like, yeah. She parts it down the middle. It's obvious she's got some kind of bun on the back of her head. But what about these random, what appear to be curls, spit curls coming down? It used to be for a 19th century young girl, she would wear her hair down until she was married. And when she was married, she'd wear her hair up. And there was the old saying that comes from Scripture that the woman's hair was her crowning glory. And so a faithful Christian woman would never cut her hair. I remember my grandmother saying to me, "Hey, Susan, you'll never make the celestial kingdom." And I could say to her, "I know that, Grandma, but how do you know?" I was being so sneaky. And she'd say, "Well, you cut your hair, you're letting everybody know." And so you'd look at Emma and you'd say, "Well, wait a minute, she cuts her hair. She's got these curls." And I'd say, no. For Emma, as she got older and she's married to Joseph, Joseph has a general store in Nauvoo, and women who had cut their Christianity or cut their hair would sell to Joseph and to other then storekeepers in town, their hair on combs. And so if a woman wanted to look prettier, more feminine, she would merely buy these combs with hairs on the end, and that's the look you get on Emma Smith. Well, we're going to learn about her life tonight from beginning to end. So as we now start out, we know that Emma is born on July 10th, 1804. You may recall that Joseph Smith is born December 23rd, 1805. So when you look at Emma, she's about a year and a half older than Joseph. She's born in a place called Harmony, Pennsylvania. Her parents were one of the first settlers there. So as we look at where Emma fits in the family, you'd say she's the third daughter in the family. She's the seventh child. Basically pioneers that are settling then in Harmony, Pennsylvania, of Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. If you were to say, what do we know about them? We obviously know the most about Isaac. He was a hunter by trade. I don't know, Clayton, if you would like to have your father-in-law be a hunter by trade.
Might not be good for me.
Yeah, but you'd say for Joseph, Isaac, he liked to hunt actually on his own property, and he owned about 600 acres at one point there in Harmony, Pennsylvania. So you'd say he's well-to-do. He was an alderman in the city, so well-respected, and he was known to drop the carcasses of dead animals on the doorsteps of widows. Now, I personally would probably be freaked out by that, but that meant that the woman would then have something to eat to care for herself. So at one point, at least in his community, he's extremely well thought of. If you were to say, what kind of house did they live in? This house has been put up by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As many of you can see, it's a beautiful house and shows financially that there's no question about it, that Emma has grown up in a more well-to-do environment than Joseph Smith. Yet we're going to find that as Joseph heads to Harmony, Pennsylvania with his father, that where he stays will be in this house as the Hale family as it opened it up to guests. Now, we'll find that Joseph Smith and his father will meet Emma in the month of October of 1825. For Joseph, when he meets Emma, he described her. And he described her as being 5'9", much to the envy of me. And so she's 5'9", but then Joseph and others will describe her as large-boned. Now, I don't know any woman that wants to be described as large-boned today, but nevertheless, it meant that with her size and so forth, that she'd be able to have children, survive childbirth, and perhaps even be able to help out on the farm, which marrying a farmer was the ultimate goal. In other words, every young man would be a farmer and perhaps a blacksmith or something else on the side. So notice Joseph meets Emma in October of 1825, and then you'd say, when do they marry? They marry January 18th, 1827, and notice they cross state lines. They move out of Pennsylvania, and they elope over in a place called Bainbridge, New York. And the question is, how did Isaac Hale take the marriage of his daughter, who was a soprano? Some reports that she was very literate, perhaps even one suggesting she may have taught school. But notice his response. He says, Isaac Hale, you have stolen my daughter and married her. I would much rather have followed her to her grave. And you'd say, why would that be? And the answer is Isaac Hale wanted more for his daughter than to be married to a man who was viewed at the time as a common laborer. And more than that, a man that claimed that he'd had visions angel, gold plates. In other words, Emma, choose anyone else. But
you
notice,
can see how if he didn't believe, in the prophet's calling, that he did not look like a winner.
Right, not the right candidate.
Yeah.
You'd probably say for your cute daughters, hey, hold on, think about this. But in the case of Emma, she will elope with Joseph, but tensions are so difficult between her and her father and perhaps even mother that Emma at that point had a dowry, like many women did at the time. I can remember having a hope chest filled with things, but for Emma, not only did she have household things, but she had a cow. And I could probably do the Johnny Lingo and you too, right? But nevertheless, she wanted those things. And tensions were so high that Joseph literally hired a neighbor, a man named Peter Ingersoll in Palmyra, to go down and to get Emma's belongings, including the cow, and to bring them back to Palmyra. So, Clayton, if you've ever had difficult in-law relationships, there's no question Joseph would understand, at least in the year 1827. Well, as we move on, we'd say, well, what came of this marriage as it relates to children? They'll have several children, so watch what happens. You've got first child, Alvin, lives only a few hours and dies. They next have twins, and their names are Thaddeus and Louisa, and within a few hours, they've died. So Emma's had 3 children, but no babies to hold in her arms. That Joseph and Emma then adopt Joseph Murdock Smith and Julia Murdock Smith, twins.
Whose mother
of those,
had died.
You'd say, Joseph is going to die in 1832 out there in Hiram, Ohio. So you'd say for Emma, she's had 5 children, but only one that would be raised to maturity and will die at age 49 before Emma. Just that alone says, I want to know more about Emma Smith and how did she survive such tragedies? I mean, we all have tragedies, but that's huge. If we were to look at the rest of their children, so there's 5. The rest of the children, 6 more, so we're talking 11 kids. You get Joseph Smith III will be the first son to live to maturity. And notice, at the death of Joseph, Julia is only 13. And then Joseph Smith III, 11. Frederick dies at 26. Alexander lives to maturity. Don Carlos dies at age 4. Male child born, not named. And then David Hyrum Smith, last child, will be born after the death of Joseph. If you were to look at her family, then, in essence, she's had 11 children to be responsible to rear, but of these 11, only 5 will live to maturity. So that alone says, Emma, man, this is tough. Well, all right, let's take Joseph and Emma now and put them together. We know then after they have eloped, they will then move to Palmyra, New York, and will stay with Father and Mother Smith and Joseph's siblings in this house then in Palmyra called their farmhouse on their 100-acre farm. From there, we know after several months that in September of 1827, that Emma will then accompany Joseph as he now heads to the Hill Cumorah. Recall the Hill Cumorah, then triangular in shape, the highest hill there in the Palmyra area. While Emma waits in the buggy, Joseph goes to the hill. He speaks then with the angel Moroni. He receives the gold plates, and then he brings them down. And then you'd say, well, what does Emma become then? Emma becomes then a scribe to the prophet Joseph. And she becomes the first person to know that Joseph Smith has the plates. We recall that Martin Harris lost 116 pages, so Emma, your turn. And it's interesting, Emma scribes about 16 pages and then concludes that she has too many domestic things to do. She can't just sit there and be a scribe. And I go, obviously, Emma and I are not related. I'm impressed with her domesticity and, the time period. But of the time she was a scribe, she said, my belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. Now, isn't that incredible? She knows that Joseph Smith, barely an elementary type of education. She's had not quite a silver spoon in her mouth living out in the frontier, but nevertheless, the opportunities for education. And yet, as she hears now her husband dictate as he translates the Book of Mormon, she says, hey, I'm right there, and I have not the slightest doubt of it. She said also, I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writings of the manuscript unless he was inspired. So I like that about Emma. She's got personal tragedies along the way, but you'd say, how's your testimony, lady? You got a dad that's angry at you. You probably got your mom too, brothers, sisters. And yet, when it comes to her testimony, she is rock solid there as we see her then in the early days of her experience. Well, after that, we know that Joseph will find a scribe that can literally sit there for hours as he dictates. It's Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery, small-boned. Recall that he's related to John Lathrop that we talked about. Yeah, right at the first. But Oliver will literally take Emma's place as a scribe. He's a school teacher by trade. He's used to that kind of work. And you'd say, when was Emma baptized? She is not baptized April 6 of 1830 when the church is organized, like Martin Harris was, or in Puerto Rockwell was, and Father Smith, Mother Smith. But when does Emma join the church? She is baptized in by Oliver Cowdery on June 28, 1830. Following her baptism, Emma has a revelation that was received by the prophet Joseph Smith. Now, that revelation today you can find in Doctrine and Covenants Section 25. Notice it comes a little bit less than a month after she was baptized. And if you were to look at all the revelations contained in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's the only one that was addressed specifically to a woman, and it's to Emma. She is told many things in that revelation, including she is elect lady, and told to, in essence, be a companion to her husband. She's also, it talks about the songs of the righteous, and eventually you get like this beautiful hymn that you did, I Know That My Redeemer Lives, as she helped select these hymns for the church, and as you indicated, published in 1835. Well, next, what we find is that Joseph's received another revelation, and that it's time for the church to gather. The first gathering place in this dispensation was Kirtland, Ohio. As Emma picks up and moves, notice she still doesn't have her own house. How would you like to live with strangers? In other words, she's lived with Joseph Smith Sr. and family. She moves in with Isaac Morley. You see the White House and Isaac's picture then above the house. And then she also lives with Newel K Whitney. Isaac eventually becomes a patriarch, and Newel K Whitney, a bishop there in Kirtland, Ohio, and lives with their family. We're going to find, finally, Joseph is translating now the Bible, and as he's doing so, a better establishment opens up, and it's going to be in a place called Hyrum, Ohio. They will move into what's called the John Johnson farmhouse, then in Hiram, Ohio. Joseph and Emma, they'll have their own bedroom. Joseph will have a room to do translation. A Bowery was built outside so the saints could come and listen to him preach. But also in Hiram, Ohio, as they move there, they've got their adopted twins. Remember Joseph and Julia? We know that in March of 1832, Joseph will be tarred and feathered. And we'll talk more about this tarring and feathering. It's not like road tar that you see on a street, but pine tar that you get when you touch pine trees, pine cones. And pine tar is put in his mouth. And there are many people in the United States that have been tarred. It was never legal. It was always a mob action. You've got Southern abolitionists. You've got wife beaters, and in March 1832, a prophet of God. When we say that Joseph was tarred and feathered, the feathers, you merely open up a pillow and you let the feathers fly all over the tar, and it's to show that you mock the man and what he stands for. So in March 1832, when Emma has had, 5 children, including these adopted twins, just literally days after her husband is tarred and feathered, that's when her son, Joseph Smith, Murdock Smith, will also die.
And they attribute that to exposure, right? Because a window was left open in the
right, exposure,
course of
windows left open, twins
him.
have been suffering, they're saying, from measles at the time. And so you look and you go, wow, Emma, is your life easy? I go, oh, no way. I've had it pretty cushy compared to what we're now learning. We know that Emma will now head back. Joseph counsels her to go back to Kirtland. In other words, we're better than being out in a more open rural area. Go into the town of Kirtland, and where Emma will live, she will not live and Joseph will join her also. But they will not then again live in the Whitney house, but instead will live on the second floor then of the Whitney store. So try and imagine everybody that comes shopping and then, hey, is a prophet up there, and suddenly you bang the ceiling with a broom and up they go. And so Emma will now live in that circumstance. We also know at this time that Emma will receive a patriarchal blessing. And I've had an occasion to read literally all the blessings given to Latter-day Saints during the time period of Joseph Smith. And,
of course you have.
Yeah,
you're the person who would have done that.
That's can't help myself. But anyway, of all the blessings, the most unusual is the one given to Emma by Joseph Smith Sr. And what makes the blessing so unusual is that there are no ifs. So I look at my blessing and thought the patriarch was stuttering, if you do this. But in the case of Emma, no ifs. And it ends with, you will be saved in the kingdom of heaven, even so, amen. And right away you look and you say, wow, Emma, you're going through pretty tough times. I've never had a husband tarred and feathered, never had to live with people constantly, and now on top of a general store, but no ifs and a promise that you'll be in the kingdom of heaven, even so, amen. Well, what does Emma do with her talents? She does, as indicated in that revelation way back in July of 1830, she does help select hymns for our first hymnal, and it's amazing how many of those hymns are still sung today. And I like that. We know that because of persecution, she and Joseph will move on to a new gathering place called Far West, Missouri. That's where in Far West you get the official name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. you also get in Far West the introduction of tithing.
Well, that's interesting because in the title page of the hymnal, I noticed it says, for the Church of the Latter-day Saints.
Right.
So now that makes sense now because you're saying it was, looks like 3 years after that we got the official name of the church.
So the church had many names, such as Church of Christ, Church of Jesus Christ, Church of Latter-day Saints, and then the official name comes in 1838, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We know that her stay in Far West was not long, and it has everything to do with what was called an extermination order. You're looking at a man that for sure boo and hiss, but this man, Governor Lilburn W Boggs, was a governor of Missouri, and he had known some of the Latter-day Saints since they first arrived in 1831 in Independence, Missouri. In fact, he even had one of the missionaries to the Lamanites named Peter Whitmer make him a suit. And so he is very familiar with the saints, and he's gone from a businessman to, by 1838, he's governor. And while governor, he makes a decision as he's listening to what's going on in the saints up there in Far West and Adamon-Diamond and Hans Mill.
And kind of some unverified reports, right?
Right. So on October 27th, 1838, he issues what's called an extermination order. And in it, he says the Mormons, which we were called by those not of our faith at times, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated, much like they'd done the Native Americans as they pushed them west or driven from the state. So you can imagine for Emma, for Joseph, difficult days followed for all Latter-day Saints. Difficult days followed. And we look and we say, well, what happens to Joseph Smith? Joseph, Hyrum, Sidney Rigdon, and others will be now placed in jail. Joseph will be in Independence Jail and Richmond Jail and transferred to Liberty Jail. While he's in Liberty Jail, Emma comes to see him, to bid him farewell. And by this point, she has 4 living children. And you'd say, oldest is Julia, 7, and she's got babes in her arms. So very difficult. And with that, she now needs to work herself out of the state of Missouri while her husband is left behind in a very difficult circumstance in Liberty Jail. For Emma, Joseph now will write her letters from Liberty Jail. And so the question is, did he love her? Did he want to be with her? Was he so aware of what she was going through with her children? Just an excerpt from one letter. I would gladly go from here to you barefoot and bareheaded and half naked to see you and think it great pleasure. So for Joseph, caring greatly about her, how was it for Emma? She made it across the state, and here's showing one of the Liz Lemon Swindle's paintings of Emma. She makes it to the Mississippi River. And as she makes it to the Mississippi River, she is crossing the river to get to the state of Illinois to be free from this extermination order. And I think Liz really depicted it well. As you see, others have wagons, horses making it across, but Emma now walks across the river, and the place that she's heading to is a little town called Quincy, Illinois. Now, Quincy will be for the Latter-day Saints our city of refuge. And for Quincyans, there were about 1,600 people in the town named for John Quincy Adams. So 1,600 people will literally take in 5,500 Latter-day Saints escaping from Governor Boggs' extermination order. And try and imagine their compassion. I've been so impressed by this little town of Quincy, and you can see the Lord has really blessed it. You go up and down the river, and today it is the biggest city. And you go, well, what happened to other towns? And I go, they just didn't make it. But Quincy, this city of brotherly love, much like Philadelphia, welcomed the Latter-day Saints into their homes. The woman that took in Emma and her children was named Sarah Cleveland. She was married to a judge there in Quincy. Well, when Joseph escapes from Liberty Jail, he will reunite with Emma and his children, and he will take the family and move upriver about 47 miles to a place called Commerce, Illinois. We know it today as Nauvoo. This will be the house that Joseph and Emma and their family will live in. Emma said of her house, "My house has been a home and resting place for thousands." Now, Clayton, I don't know how well you like visitors, but try and imagine. She's saying, hey, it's been a resting place for thousands. At one point, W Phelps, who wrote the song Praise to the Man and the Spirit of God Like a Fire is Burning, the poem, he said to Emma that he had an idea how Emma wouldn't have to feed so many people as they're all coming to this house. And he said, what you need to do is to get a table that will feed only one, much like Napoleon Bonaparte in the great wars in Europe. He had a table that would feed only one. So when his soldiers would come to him and say they wanted to eat or they were hungry, he'd say, well, I just don't have room because my table, it feeds only one. And Emma said back to Phelps, she said, my husband is a bigger man than Napoleon Bonaparte, that he cannot possibly eat without his friends. And I see Emma in Commerce in what becomes known as Nauvoo as the hostess with the mostest. You're hungry, I have something for you.
Yeah, she spent all that time, living in other people's houses, I guess, and on their turf. If you're an in-law and live in your parent or your in-law's basement or something, you know a little bit how that feels. But she returned the favor, I guess.
Yeah,
seems
that's
like
a wonderful way to look at it.
Manyfold.
Manyfold. Well, you'd say, what happens for Emma in Nauvoo? There's no question that she was the First Lady of Nauvoo. In fact, on March 17th, 1842, the Relief Society was organized in a store that Joseph had called the Red Brick Store. In the downstairs of the store, you'd be able to shop, but the second floor, that's sacred space. That's where the Book of Abraham's translated, the Articles of Faith written, first endowments, first sealings, and you'd say it's also where on March 17th, 1842, where the Relief Society was organized. They actually had an election of the women that came there, and there were about 20 women. They ranged in age from 59 to 18, so a little bit like most Relief Societies, right? But they held an election, and the women elected Emma to be president. And Joseph actually said to her, this fulfills then the blessing she had gotten way back in 1830, you find in section 25, where she's told she's an elect lady. So she was elected by her peers. We could definitely say she's the first lady of Nauvoo. And then the question comes, well, who would she select as her counselors? So her counselors are not elected. The lady with the hat, she selects Elizabeth Whitney, a woman she had lived with in Kirtland, and already knows she's charitable. And I like that. And then she selects Sarah Cleveland, a lady in a more fancy dress, right? And Emma had lived with her in Quincy. So I liked how she stacked her presidency it's easy to see that her view of Relay Society was, we are going to be charitable. And what a great example of first president of Relay Society. What I find interesting of their meetings is that women never taught women. That's a Utah thing. It wasn't until they came west, and it wasn't really till almost the 1869, 70s that you start to see women teach women. So you'd say, who were then the first teachers of Emma's Relay Society? Well, her husband Joseph, and then John Taylor in the middle, and Willard Richards. They're your main teachers. What I like is that Emma selected as her secretary Eliza R Snow. Now, Eliza R Snow, if you were to put her writings together, you've got about 1,800 pages, 8.5 by 11, and she not only does poetry, but also has kind of a regular contribution to the newspapers in Nauvoo. But Eliza's the secretary. I don't know if she ever shut her eyes even during the prayer. She's writing notes on what these men are talking about to the Relay Society women. Now, I can always tell when someone is quoting Joseph Smith speaking to Relay Society, because although he talks about a myriad of topics, he always comes down to two things. He always says these two things in the lessons to the women. One is, women, bridle your tongues. In other words, stop gossiping. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I do have something in common with the women of Nauvoo. But nevertheless, he's saying, hey, bridle your tongues. And then the second big thing he's saying is, women, provoke your husbands. Now, I'm good at that too. But he says, provoke your husbands to righteousness. And then I go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. And so, in other words, send your husband off to the priesthood meetings, to elders' quorum presidency, to do his ministering or whatever he needs to do. So I think just wonderful lessons were then taught to the women by these brethren. For Emma, after Relay Society, the women who had come then to the first Relay Society and subsequent, they would carry back then little baskets, much like we carry purses. If I want to lose my glasses, my keys, they're always in my purse, right? But you'd carry a basket, and when you went to Relay Society, you were going up, much like you go up to Zion, up to Jerusalem, up to holiness. And as the women would carry these baskets, they would have doilies over what they were going to give to Emma after the lessons. Because after all, charity never faileth. And so some would then bring to Emma here a couple of pennies to buy glass for the windows of the Nauvoo temple. Others were, here's buttons, here's booties. It's whatever they had brought. And then the women would go out and canvass their wards. There were 4 wards at first in Nauvoo, and then eventually 10. And they would keep bringing these things to Emma at her house. And at this point, as she saw so much coming in, she said of Relay Society, we will do something extraordinary. And then in her 19th century mind, she tries to think, what's the most extraordinary thing? And she goes, well, for example, when a steamboat is stuck on the sandbars out in the Mississippi River, that the women will go out, they will lift it up and pull it to shore. My, those women had to be buffed. But what she was really trying to say is, we're going to do something extraordinary. And I've lived to see that fulfilled time and time again with amazing charitable work that's been done at a local level, national and international. Well, for Emma, how long was she the president? She was the president for exactly 2 years. She becomes the elect lady there in the red brick store. And then a few months before Joseph's death, she actually stops Relay Society. And so Relay Society exists for 2 years. When they cross the plains and all of that, no Relay Society. When they're establishing little towns like Provo and Willard and Ogden and Utah, no Relay Society. but Relief Society will then start up much later under Brigham Young. Well, the next big event in Emma's life will, of course, have everything to do with the martyrdom. So we see Emma at this point, she's living in the mansion house, and she's living on the second floor for the most part. And she has her final goodbye to Joseph, June 24th. Joseph will have left. He comes back. He bids farewell to Emma. He asks Emma, he says that he would like to give her a priesthood blessing, but he's got to hurry on to Carthage. He asks Emma to write out that blessing, and anything she asks for will be hers. Now, I've always wanted a blessing like that.
He said he'd sign it, right?
Yeah. And then he's going to sign it, whatever she asks. Well, we know that the martyrdom will then occur on June 27th, 1844, in a place called Carthage, Illinois. And actually, it's one of my favorite places to visit. We know that Joseph's last words as he holds his hands high out of the upper story window, his last words will be, "Oh my God." And
"Oh Lord, my God."
And then we'll fall face down by an open well. And here showing then statues of Joseph and Emma. Well, what happens to Emma? Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay, so the statues then of Joseph and his older brother Hyrum. Good. We then look at the grief now of the family. There's no question, very, very difficult. Mary Fielding Smith, dressed in her finest, brings Joseph F. Smith to say farewell to his father Hyrum. Therein, Joseph and Hyrum's bodies were placed in separate boxes. There was great concern about would there be riots, would the people in Nauvoo rush to Carthage and cause problems. And so you'd say as they looked at the bodies were in like a casket, but the casket was sealed tight except for the faces. And there was a piece of glass that went literally over their face, had a hinge. And so you could step forward, see the body, well, not really see the bodies, but see the faces. You could kiss the face, you could touch the face, and then move on out. Now, before there was a public viewing in the mansion house, obviously the martyrs' widows will be invited in, as well as Lucy Mack Smith and other members of the Smith family. For Emma, we have some words that she said at that time as she's moving towards Joseph, who's there laying literally in death, and he's got the casket. The only thing she can see then is his face. She says, "Oh, Joseph, Joseph, my husband, have they taken you from me at last?" And now Emma is a widow. And as a widow, she's also pregnant with her last child. And her last child born then a few months after the death of Joseph. And she names her child David, and then after Joseph's brother Hyrum, David Hyrum Smith. Well, what's life like for Emma? As we look at her at this point, we now see her as a mother of 5. Remember, she started out, she could have been a mother of 11, but that didn't work. So how old is Julia at the death of Joseph? She's 13. And then you go Joseph Smith III, Frederick, Alexander, David Hyrum, born after the death of Joseph. And the big question is, what's Emma going to do now? Well, we know that Brigham Young has returned to Nauvoo after serving as a political volunteer for Joseph's campaign for president of these United States. He's returning back from Massachusetts. Once he's back, his goal is complete the temple, build a town, and he renames the town of Nauvoo, remember it was commerce, to City of Joseph, and asks people to build their memory of the prophet Joseph Smith. And then finally in February of 1846, he says, flee Babylon by land or by sea. In other words, get out of the United States. And as Brigham Young and the saints begin to exit then Nauvoo, the question is, what about Emma? Emma doesn't show her hands. It's like playing cards. She's not showing her hand. Many are trying to second guess, is Emma coming west? Is she not? I mean, she doesn't show her hand. She's interested in taking care of her family. She stays pretty much around the mansion house. And people, as they try to second guess Emma, some will actually go into Carthage because they didn't want to leave their houses that were built for the memory of Joseph Smith in the hands of squatters. And so they went to Carthage and they gave their houses to Emma for $1 and consideration in memory of Joseph Smith. So as the saints now head out, Emma hasn't shown her hand which way she's going, but in the meantime, she is becoming the most well-to-do landowner in all of Nauvoo. And some of you who have early ancestors that had lived in Nauvoo may want to check out and see if some of your ancestors are the ones that gave Emma their properties. Well, Emma then will stay in February of 1846. She's still in Nauvoo. She's still in Nauvoo in the spring. But then comes a battle in Nauvoo. And when the battle bursts out in September of 46, many of the saints are gone. Emma's still there. But she wakes up the first morning after the first day of battle and discovers that there's been a fire set to her home, the mansion house, and you realize it's all built out of wood. And she views it as miraculous that it was not torn down. So in the midst of the battle, she's now very afraid. She now puts the mansion house up for sale. And as she does so, she takes Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, is his Bible, and she's out of there. She puts the mansion house up for sale, and Emma moves to a place called Fulton, Illinois. So in September of 46, she moves to Fulton, Illinois with her children. In the meantime, her house is sold to a man named Abram Van Tool. She starts receiving letters from friends still in Nauvoo saying, I don't know if you know this, but he's taking your furnishings and he's sending them downriver and he's selling them down in St. Louis. And so as Emma receives these words, her comments were, I have no place to go but back to Nauvoo, and I have no friends but God. And with that, Emma leaves from a very short stay in Fulton, and she returns back to Nauvoo. As she returns back to Nauvoo to support herself and her 5 children, she opens up her house as a hotel. Now, when we think of hotels, we think of a 1-night, 2-night stay, and hopefully we're not here in the same place for 3 nights, right? But back then, hotels were places where, almost like a rest home, where senior citizens would stay. It was also a place where bachelors would stay, and they were like the bread and butter. They were permanent. And then, of course, there would be rooms available for more transient visitors. One of the bachelors who had been married before but moves into Emma's hotel is this man named Louis Bidamon. And Louis Bidamon, he is a carriage maker. He is Emma's very same age, and they will marry. and they will marry in the local Methodist church. So now the question happens, well, what happens to Lewis and Emma? For Lewis and Emma, upon marriage, then Lewis's name goes on a lot of that property that Emma had received from the early saints as they fled. Different times, and I don't even know if they had prenuptial agreements, right? But very difficult. When the Nauvoo temple caught fire, and then there's big winds, and suddenly it's the Nauvoo temple is just rubble, not a stone upon a stone kind of thing. And by 1865, the city council has said, hey, there's just one wall standing. It's too dangerous. We're pulling that one down. When Nauvoo loses the temple, it loses the reason that many visitors were coming to see Nauvoo. In other words, up and down the Mississippi River, they'd been saying for years that there was an eighth wonder of the world. It wasn't the temple itself, but it was the font in the basement on the backs of 12 oxen. That was, and that people were doing baptisms for the dead. And once the temple is down, well, B.H. Roberts perhaps says it best, that Nauvoo is the blight. And for Emma, her hotel business kind of really tanks. And how do you pay all the taxes on properties that they own? Louis Bidamon heads to California to the gold fields in hopes of recouping their fortunes. Does not succeed. He comes back to Emma, penniless, really. And the question is, how is life for Emma? When Louis comes back, he has some kind of illicit affair with a woman named Nancy, and as he does so, he fathers a child named Charlie, and Nancy and Charlie will live in the mansion house with Emma.
Wow.
So if you were to look at this woman, you'd say, wait a minute, 11 kids, she only raises 5. Her husband's tarred and feathered. He's then in jail, and he's finally martyred. And now I choose someone my own age to marry. He goes to the gold fields. He comes back, and, wow, he can't be treating her great. And you'd say, what happens to Emma from this point on out? We'll just hit some of the highlights. One of the things that happens to Emma is that on April 6, 1860, she joins the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The first vote at a conference of that church in a place called Amboy, Illinois, the first vote is, do you accept Joseph Smith III? Joseph and Emma's oldest son, right? Do you accept him as basically the prophet, seer, and revelator of this reorganization? And the vote is unanimous. The second vote is, do you accept Emma as a member of this church? Notice she is not rebaptized. It is viewed that her baptism way back in June of 1830 by Oliver Cowdery was good enough for her to be accepted into membership. For Emma, for the next several years, she now attends the meetings of the olive branch of the Reorganized Church. And notice where they meet. They meet in the red brick store, the same store that Joseph owned, and the same place where Joseph pronounced Emma an elect lady as she was leading Relief Society. It is rumored that Emma also puts together a hymn book for the reorganization. Well, what else happens to her? We look and say, well, how does her family look like? You can see there's Louis Bidamon. You get Joseph Smith III on the bottom. You get Alexander, Frederick, David. Well, what happens to this family? We know that Julia Murdock Smith, she will marry a Catholic man and become a Catholic there in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith III will be president of the Reorganized Church for almost 50 years. Frederick dies at 26. Alexander and David will become apostles in the reorganization. David Hyrum Smith at one point even put in the first presidency, but ultimately will be taken and incarcerated in an insane asylum in Elgin, Illinois, and will spend out his days there. So if we were to look at Emma, what about her? For Emma, she dies at age 74. She's born in 1804. She dies April 30th, 1879. She dies in Nauvoo, Illinois. She is buried next to her husband, Joseph Smith Jr. What she has on then as she's buried, she's wearing a gold necklace, buried in a green dress with magenta flowers. So what do we think about Emma as we come to the end of this, Clayton?
This is a hard one for me, Susan. I mean, Martin Harris had, some difficult chapters of his life. Emma is like the extreme of the extreme to me. I mean, the stuff she went through is just extraordinary. I don't know if anybody can, well, maybe somebody can match that. I don't know, but
certainly
it'd be
not
pretty
me.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah, just so hard.
And, obviously it's heartbreaking for me to think of how, she did not stay with the main body of the saints, and it didn't seem like a very happy life after that. And you just, from my perspective, I think, why couldn't you just have gone with Brigham Young? And tell us a little bit about her and Brigham Young, can you?
Yes.
Because that was there was some friction.
Yeah, there was
right?
definitely friction. In fact, she viewed as one of her achievements was she outlived Brigham. And Brigham died in 1877. But you don't get, I can't find any friction between Emma and Brigham while Joseph was alive. But when she becomes a widow, then you can see little things kind of got her. At one point, Brigham became a lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion and asked Emma if he could borrow then Joseph's uniform and Joseph's horse as he reviewed the troops. And Emma said yes, and when he returned the uniform, it hadn't been cleaned and the horse hadn't been kind of brushed down. And you'd say, ladies, what gets us? It's the little things, right? And then, of course, she is keeping in her possession Joseph's translation of the Bible, is his Coopertown Bible, and Brigham Young is very interested in acquiring that. And for Joseph, I'm hard put to say anything against him, but when it came to finance, it wasn't always clear, is this a church buy or a personal buy for he and his family? And because of that lack of clarity, that will also cause great issues between the two. And I see it as a great hardship for Brigham Young trying to resolve it and no solution.
Because he viewed a lot of the property as belonging to the church, and
right.
She viewed it as belonging to the family.
Right. And so...
And then it just, there were statements made by I'm thinking of a statement where he said, Joseph had said that I'd go to hell for a woman like that, referring to Emma, and Brigham Young saying, yeah, and he's going to have to, or
yep.
something to that effect.
Yeah, you do get those being passed from generation to generation, so very difficult. And then when Emma's sons, two of them go out to Utah to try and convert, quote, the Brighamites to become the Josephites, meaning part of the restoration, that also did not sit well with Brigham Young. But then the question comes, what about Emma? When I was younger, and mind you, I looked the same, right, Clayton?
Exactly.
Exactly.
You've always looked great.
When I was younger, I could really bash Emma for the decision to not go west.
Yeah, that's very. For me too, it's hard to be like, "Come on, Emma, this." Isn't it obvious that Brigham's the guy? And obviously, it wasn't for everybody. But it's from my perspective. Years later, it's like, come on.
Right.
But okay, yeah. Tell me about how you came.
So then, I study her life. I see all these hardships that she goes through, and I guess there are two things that just say to me, hey, I'll be lucky as heck to see her in the next life. And one is, remember that patriarchal blessing, no ifs. You'll be saved in the kingdom of heaven, even so, amen. And so I see that as one that I need to give pause and rethink. And then I know that she and Joseph were sealed for time and all eternity. And those sealings are true. They're binding. And so, I've said to my husband, what if you die and I really mess up? Will you come to find me? And, he's like, for sure. and so
if you read section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, there's something in there that talks about that. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but if you're sealed, then it's almost like it's like you can even do bad stuff, or I don't want to give the wrong impression. I don't want to teach anything wrong, but
don't want everybody messing up.
If you're sealed, I'll let people look for it themselves. But if you're sealed, that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's powerful. And what are the chances that Joseph Smith, who would have walked bareheaded, barefoot, just for a chance to see Emma from Liberty Jail, wouldn't be looking everywhere to find her, and to be with her for all eternity. So, and I've thought about, I wouldn't for the life of me want to bash, the living prophet's wife, right? How would that look?
Yep.
And so what gives me the right to judge? And there have been different books written, Judge Me, Dear Reader, about Emma, but I'm not really sure that it's our place. In other words, we all walk in, we're trying to stay on the covenant path, but, somehow it's a little bit of an individual path with the very many trials that come our way.
Yeah, it's like a mind-opening, heart-opening thing to contemplate her story.
Right. I think it will give our listeners a lot to think about this week.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Susan. It's been a big one. So thank you for helping us understand Emma a little better, hopefully.
Hey, you're welcome. I'd love to hear you sing again. I think that's the favorite part of the.
Well, I don't know about the favorite, but it's my job. So, all right, I'll try a different verse.
Great.
We'll do maybe how about 3? He lives, my kind, wise, heavenly friend. He lives and loves me to the end. He lives, and while he lives, I'll sing. He lives, my prophet, priest, and king. He lives and grants me daily breath. He lives, and I shall conquer death. He lives, my mansion to prepare. He lives to bring me safely there. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody, this has been episode 5 of the podcast. Very privileged, of course, to have with us Susan Easton Black. What a miracle that we can get her. And it's just great, Susan. I'm so excited all the time when I think about the fact that we can do this podcast. It's for me at least, it's a privilege.
Me too. It's a great privilege.
Good. So we'll continue next week, and y'all have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time. Any last words, Susan?
No, just thanks for listening.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Goodbye.
Sorry about my dog. You know, I might I might take her upstairs real quick. Give me a second.